The idea of the vampire as institution is at least hinted at in several vampire stories by Calgarian writers, all written at much the same time. The last precursor vampire story that I looked at before the vampire stories in Evolve was Vampires of the Rockies by Randy McCharles, which appears in another series by Edge Science Fiction and Fantasy Publications called Tesseracts. Tesseracts is a yearly anthology of Canadian science fiction and fantasy, the 13th volume of which was co-edited by David Morrell and Nancy Kilpatrick. Nancy Kilpatrick took several vampire stories that didn't fit into Tesseracts 13 and built the first Evolve anthology around them. In the Tesseracts from a couple of years before number 13, Randy's story, Vampires of the Rockies, takes the problem of how you write a Canadian vampire story and examines it, largely by lampooning Bram Stoker's approach. What Bram Stoker did was look at the vampiric aspects of the British Empire and then put them in a part of the world where they didn't really belong, thereby spawning an entire tourist industry of people going to another part of the world to view something that was the product of the British Empire's imagination. In Vampires of the Rockies, we have vampires from Romania, or acting like vampires from Romania, transposed and put into another context where they don't belong, which is in Banff National Park, where vampires are given protected status, much like that of grizzly bears, therefore making fun of our tendency to romanticize the aspects of nature that only want to rip out our throats. The possibility of saying vampires are the Rockies rather than of is one of the influences that made me think of taking the idea one step further in my own story. At the same time, in the Evolve anthologies, other authors that I've met were exploring similar themes, although I wasn't aware of what they were writing at the time. You have another instance in Evolve of a park being associated with a vampire, in this case a park called the Suicide Forest in Japan. On bittenbybooks.com, there's a discussion where all the first volume Evolve writers got together and talked about their stories, and Heather Clitheroe mentions this one forest at the base of Mount Fuji as being the second most popular place in the world for people to commit suicide, after the Golden Gate Bridge. Suicide is associated with vampires in Romanian folklore because suicide is one of the methods of creating a vampire. In this one, the problem of how you write a Canadian vampire story is dealt with not by transposing a vampire story from another culture, but by taking the Canadian character and putting that character in another culture where there are vampire-like creatures. In this case, a fox demon who lives in the Suicide Forest and lures the visiting Canadian character to her doom. And there's a follow-up story in the second volume of Evolve, which is set in much the same place, with another Canadian character who knew the one from the first volume. You also have Erica Holt's story, which I think has strong political elements in that you have a suicide pact between a straight white woman and a gay black man. They make what I see as the politically self-destructive agreement that should one of them ever be bitten by a vampire and start to turn into a vampire, the other one will kill the infected character. This raises the question, for me at least, that if suicide is a way of generating a vampire, what happens if you assist in a suicide? This story also starts in Calgary, but the transformation into a vampire is not completed in Calgary. The characters leave. Kevin Cockle's story, Sleepless in Calgary, also addresses the question of whether Calgary is an appropriate setting for vampire stories, and what elements in the city are putting us to the point where we can start thinking of vampires as something that represents Calgary. In this one, he has a character who is living a very isolated, overworked, and demoralized existence. He imagines the vampire into existence because of the influences of the city around him. And at the close of the story, the city is depicted as something nascently vampiric in the hum of its traffic and the numbing effect of the work office workers have to engage in. In Nosangreal, I did much as you've seen in the slides leading up to this. I essentially made a laundry list of what the characteristics of a vampire were, and then went looking around the city to try to find something that would match all of those characteristics as closely as possible, whether it was a fantasy creation or something in real life.